So, right. So, good evening, everybody, and welcome to this second in our series of seminars on the Cuban Missile Crisis. I'm very happy to be able to say that we have a good, strong connection at the moment with Cuba. And sitting before you on the screen is Tomás Diez Acosta, who is the author of the seminal work of Cuban history on the Cuban Missile Crisis. And with him is his collaborator, Professor Håkan Karlsson from Gothenburg University in Sweden. Together they have actually also published a book on the missile crisis. Håkan is an archaeological historian and has worked on the sites that remain of the installations that the Soviets built in Cuba to house the missiles and the troop emplacements that were with them. So it's really amazingly opportune for us to have this exchange. Tomás is also a veteran of the incident itself. He was a very young man at the time of the missile crisis 60 years ago. He was 18 years old, and he actually was serving in the militia, which had been mobilized to defend Cuba from the very likely invasion by the United States, which was imminent at the time. And that's some of the things that he will talk about. So I'm recording the session, and it will be made available on YouTube following this meeting. So first of all, I'm going to ask Tomás to say a few words. Tomás will speak in Spanish, and I'm going to try and translate as we go along. So please forgive us if there are problems with understanding, if the sound quality isn't that great. Sometimes I might not catch what he says, so I will actually have to ask for your patience with that. Bueno, Tomás, ya empezábamos. Ya hizo una introducción y tienes la palabra. Por favor, habla despacito, despacito, y si me puedes parar después una sentencia o algo para que permite la posibilidad para mí a traducirlo, ¿ok?
Bien, muchas gracias. En primer lugar, quiero agradecer a los organizadores de esta conferencia la invitación a hablarle de la llamada crisis de los misiles. Para Cuba se llama la Crisis de Octubre de 1962.
Okay, so first of all, I'd like to say a great thanks to the people who have made it possible for us to participate in this conference. And I'm going to say a few words about the so-called missile crisis, as it is known, but in Cuba is known as the Crisis of October. Sigue.
Este año se ha conmemorado el 60 aniversario de ese hecho histórico que conmovió a la humanidad porque puso en peligro de una hecatombe atómica. Es decir, no solamente era un hecho producido por una relación bilateral entre Cuba y Estados Unidos, sino que participaban las dos principales potencias nucleares de la época, es decir, Estados Unidos y la Unión Soviética.
Thank you. So it's now the 60th anniversary of this event, which put in danger the world of atomic catastrophe, because it didn't only include the antagonism between Cuba and the United States, but also involved the two greatest superpowers on the planet, the United States and the Soviet Union. Gracias. Sigue.
Para los cubanos, este fue un acontecimiento o un episodio dentro de todas esas hechos que han tenido lugar durante más de 60 años de relaciones de contradictorias con Estados Unidos. Es decir, ha sido un hecho más, pero que trascendió las relaciones bilaterales y se convirtió en un hecho mundial. Ahora, para los cubanos, ¿qué motivó la crisis de octubre? Para los cubanos, lo que motivó la crisis de octubre de 1962 era la política practicada por Estados Unidos hasta ese momento contra la revolución cubana, que estaba dirigida al cambio del régimen social.
So, what does this crisis mean for Cuba? Well, the events that occurred 60 years ago were a culmination of policies that the United States had followed towards Cuba for many years leading up to it. And what does it mean for Cubans? Well, it is an event that transcended the bilateral relationship and involved the Soviet Union, because it was a culmination of policies that the United States had followed towards the Cuban Revolution since its victory in 1959.
Es decir, que los cubanos estábamos defendiendo nuestra autodeterminación, nuestra soberanía nacional. Es decir, estamos defendiendo principios esenciales de la vida de un país. Nos habíamos liberado en el 59 y estábamos ahora defendiendo nuestro país, nuestra independencia nacional ante las acciones que se desarrollaban por la superpotencia más grande y poderosa de la época, que era Estados Unidos de América.
So what was Cuba doing? Cuba was defending its national self-determination and its sovereignty against the United States, the greatest superpower on the planet. And that's what Cuba was doing during this time. The United States had usurped Cuban sovereignty and was trying to bring about regime change on the island, and Cuba was trying to defend itself.
Es decir, que dentro de un mundo bipolar, existía en el año 1962, Cuba, en esa lucha por defender su soberanía, contó desde los primeros tiempos, fundamentalmente desde 1960, con el apoyo de la Unión Soviética.
So in this defense of its national sovereignty, Cuba had depended since 1960 on the support of the Soviet Union.
La revolución cubana no fue el resultado de la intervención soviética en Cuba, fue el resultado de la lucha independiente del pueblo cubano contra una dictadura como fue la de Batista, pro-imperialista. Y el pueblo cubano, cuando alcanza la independencia, comienza un proceso de transformaciones políticas, económicas, sociales, que rompía en cierta medida la hegemonía que imperaba en América Latina por parte de Estados Unidos.
So Cuba didn't owe its independence to an intervention by the Soviet Union. The revolution of Cuba in 1959 was a consequence of the struggle of the Cuban people themselves to liberate themselves and to establish their own national sovereignty and self-determination. And it was this act that flew in the face of the hegemony of the United States in Latin America at that time.
La propia medida en que se llevaban a cabo las medidas revolucionarias en pos de recuperar los bienes nacionales fue aumentando la agresividad de Estados Unidos hacia Cuba. En primer lugar, en el año 59, en mayo de 59, se aprueba la ley de reforma agraria, que ataca el latifundio predominante en Cuba hasta aquel momento.
So there was a process whereby every time Cuba worked to make the national resources available to the Cuban people, the aggression of the United States increased. So, for example, in 1959, with the Agrarian Reform Law, which broke the monopoly of the latifundistas, the large landowners that had dominated Cuba up to that point.
Desde ese momento comenzaron las presiones y las agresiones, primero de presiones diplomáticas, posteriormente de campañas ideológicas, hasta llegar a un momento a la agresión económica.
From that moment of the passing of the Agrarian Reform Law, the aggressions from the United States began. First of all, in the form of diplomatic pressure, then in terms of economic pressure, and later in terms of military pressure, and so on.
1960 fue un año de confrontación intensa entre Estados Unidos y Cuba. Fue el año en que, en primer lugar, cesan el suministro de petróleo, cesa prácticamente la cuota azucarera cubana que por ley tenía que comprar Estados Unidos a Cuba. Comienza todas unas acciones y Cuba se defiende y comienzan primero las intervenciones y después las nacionalizaciones de las empresas extranjeras, fundamentalmente de Estados Unidos en Cuba. Y este año se comienza a organizar lo que fue posteriormente la invasión mercenaria de bahías de Cochino.
So the year of 1960 was a year of intense aggression from the United States. That was the year in which they began to reduce the amount of oil supply to Cuba. They cut the sugar quota, which meant that Cuba could no longer sell sugar into the United States. And they also began to plan for what was going to happen the following year, the mercenary invasion at the Bay of Pigs.
Comenzaron toda una cadena de agresiones económicas, militares, políticas, una guerra encubierta que perseguía, desde el punto de vista económico, crear una situación en el país tan difícil que los propios cubanos trataran de rebelarse contra el gobierno revolucionario. Y no pasó así. Se equivocaron.
So they unleashed a chain of actions, economic, diplomatic, political, military, which was had the aim of making life as difficult as possible for the Cuban people, with the intention that this would provoke them to rebel against their own government. And that just didn't happen.
La invasión mercenaria de Bahía de Cochino en abril de 1961 fue un fracaso total para el gobierno de Estados Unidos y sobre todo para la nueva administración que había tomado el poder el 20 de enero de ese año, la administración Kennedy.
So the mercenary attack at the Bay of Pigs in April 1961 was a complete failure for the United States, and in particular an enormous failure for the new administration that had taken over in Washington, that of President Kennedy.
Después del giro, Estados Unidos tuvo que reorganizar todo el aparato subversivo contra Cuba. Y a finales del año 61 elaboró la Operación Mangosta,
So the failure at Playa Girón, as the Cubans call it, or the Bay of Pigs as it's known elsewhere, provoked the government into having to rethink its strategy towards Cuba. And so in late 1961, they started what became known as Operation Mongoose.
Esta operación Mongoose ya no era dirigida como fue anteriormente por la CIA, sino por el gobierno completo de Estados Unidos y sobre todo por el Pentágono, el Departamento de Estado, el Departamento del Tesoro, la CIA y el Departamento de Defensa, que jugaba un papel. Fíjense que la oficina del Proyecto Cuba o de la Operación Mangosta estaba en el propio Pentágono, es decir, en el Departamento de Defensa.
So this Operation Mongoose was different from previous operations against Cuba because it wasn't run by the CIA, but from the Department of Defense, and included also the State Department. So this was a government-run operation rather than just being from the CIA. It was housed in the Pentagon, the Department of Defense itself.
Nosotros no conocíamos la operación, pero sí conocíamos los cubanos los efectos de esa operación. ¿Cuáles fueron los primeros efectos en Cuba de esa operación? Primero, en enero de 1962, la expulsión del gobierno cubano de la OEA, es decir, la política de aislamiento diplomático de Cuba en la región.
So, what was this operation? Well, we didn't know at the time what it was, but we knew its effects at the time. And what were the effects? Well, the first one was isolation, the ejection of Cuba from the Organization of American States. In other words, the Department of State doing everything it could to isolate Cuba in the Western Hemisphere by making other countries break off diplomatic relations with Cuba.
La segunda medida importante, pocos días después, en febrero, primeros días de febrero, fue la aplicación del bloqueo económico, comercial y financiero, que ellos llamaron embargo económico.
The next step was in February 1962, the imposition of the complete economic blockade of Cuba, which the United States calls an embargo. In other words, breaking off all trade relationships with Cuba.
Después, en ese contexto, se incrementaron las acciones encubiertas y secretas de sabotaje, de atentados terroristas contra instalaciones, contra la población civil, contra el campesinado. Se incrementó las bandas armadas contrarrevolucionarias en las montañas cubanas.
And then the third phase was the increase in terrorist activity, sabotage, covert operations, as they're called, against installations, entities, and individuals in Cuba.
En ese momento, entre los meses de marzo, abril y mayo, se incrementaron los ejercicios navales de las Fuerzas Armadas de Estados Unidos en el área del Caribe, con desembarcos navales en Puerto Rico.
So then in March, April, and May, they began naval exercises in the Caribbean and practiced landings and so forth in islands such as Puerto Rico.
Es decir, ese fue el contexto en que se produjo la propuesta de la Unión Soviética de instalar armas nucleares en Cuba.
So this explains the context in which it became, in which the Soviet Union proposed the idea of installing missiles in Cuba.
Es decir, ellos aprovechan eso ahí, la operación Mangosta, los resultados de la operación Mangosta. Ellos llegan a la conclusión que los Estados Unidos va a invadir a Cuba, que están preparando las condiciones.
So what Operation Mongoose did was it made the Cuban authorities and the Soviets form the opinion that all of this was in preparation for an invasion, that the United States was planning to invade Cuba, and that's what was going on, and that's the context.
En ese contexto, en mayo de 1962 viene una delegación a Cuba de la Unión Soviética, en la cual venía un mariscal Virusio, y dos generales más de las tropas coheteriles estratégicas de la Unión Soviética.
So in May of 1962, a delegation from the Soviet Union arrived, which included a marshal and two generals of the Rockets Division.
Oigo, esa comisión venía enmascarada, encubierta. Venían como si fuera una comisión de técnicos agrícolas que venían a ayudar a Cuba en esa rama, fundamentalmente en problemas de...
Of course, they came in a disguised manner. They came posing as an agricultural technical delegation.
¿Qué plantearon? Ellos venían con la encomienda de Nikita Khrushchev, máximo líder de la Unión Soviética, de que para defender a Cuba no solamente bastaba con declaraciones, sino que había que hacer algo efectivo, instalar estos medios, es decir, cohetes de alcance medio e intermedio, los famosos cohetes R-12 y R-14.
So, what did they suggest? Well, they came with a message from the president of the Soviet Union, Khrushchev himself, which said that it was necessary in order to defend Cuba to make more than declarations of defense, but actually to do something that was concrete, that would have an effect. And that was, it was suggested that they would install missiles, the famous rockets R-16s and R-17s.
Cuba no estaba pensando en armas nucleares ni en cohetes, porque y esa proposición se le hicieron a Cuba, es decir, ellos tuvieron que pedirle permiso a Cuba para hacer eso. Y se le propuso a la dirección política cubana, al comandante jefe Fidel Castro, hacer eso. Dice como el comandante en nuestras conferencias que se realizaron en el año 1992 y en el 2002, que Cuba no estaba pensando en cohetes.
Cuba at this moment was not actually thinking about having missiles. The commander-in-chief, Fidel Castro, at conferences that we held in 1992 and 2002, told us that at the moment, Cuba, they were not thinking of having missiles at all when they were proposed.
Pues él creía que para defender a Cuba no se necesitaban los cohetes, sino que bastaba con un acuerdo soviético-cubano en que quedara expresamente dicho que una agresión a Cuba significaría una agresión a la Unión Soviética y se hubieran logrado los mismos fines.
What the Cubans thought was that all that was necessary to defend Cuba was not missiles or nuclear arms, but simply a military agreement between the Soviet Union and Cuba, which said that an aggression against Cuba would be considered to be an aggression against the Soviet Union itself, and that would be sufficient.
Porque esos cohetes en Cuba nos convertía a este país, a Cuba, en una base soviética, lo cual afectaba la imagen de Cuba hacia América, la imagen política de Cuba hacia América Latina.
And the reason for this was that to have missiles in Cuba would turn Cuba into a Soviet base, which would affect the reputation or the image of Cuba in the rest of the region and turn it into something other than it was.
Bueno, se pregunta, ¿y por qué lo aceptamos?
And then the question is, why did we accept the missiles then?
En primer lugar, entendimos que la propuesta era, inicialmente, estaba dirigida a fortalecer la capacidad defensiva del campo socialista frente a Estados Unidos.
So the first thing was that we considered it to be necessary for strengthening the defense of the whole of the Soviet camp against the hostility of the United States.
En un momento que había una gran disparidad estratégica, tanto en ojivas nucleares como en medios portadores a favor de Estados Unidos.
So because at that moment there was a big disparity between the capacity of the Soviet Union and the United States.
Más aún cuando los Estados Unidos habían colocado bases coheteriles cerca de las fronteras de la Unión Soviética.
Principally, this was because the United States had installed missiles very close to the frontier of the Soviet Union.
Como fueron los cohetes Júpiter en Turquía.
There were, for example, missiles in Turkey.
Por lo tanto, se decidió aceptar esos cohetes, porque realmente iba con el objetivo internacionalista de apoyar, de colaborar con el campo socialista en su fortalecimiento. Y en segundo lugar, porque era realmente un importante disuasivo a una agresión militar directa de Estados Unidos.
So principally, the missiles were accepted as a means to assist the defense of the whole of the Soviet or socialist camp. And then only secondarily, because they would act as a deterrent to American military action against Cuba.
Ahora, ¿cómo sería ese despliegue? Tenía que tener tres condiciones: que fuera secreto, rápido y oculto.
So what was necessary? Well, the Soviets wanted them to be secret and covert, installed secretly, rapidly, secretly, and covertly.
Ahora bien, cuando los cubanos conocimos el tipo de armamento que venía, el tamaño de los armamentos que venían, nos dimos cuenta que era muy difícil que ese despliegue se hiciera de manera oculta.
And as soon as the Cubans realized, perdóname, let me translate that bit. As soon as the Cubans realized exactly the kind of weaponry that the Soviets were planning to introduce, we realized that it was impossible to keep it secret. Sigue.
Eran cohetes que tenían 24 metros de largo.
They were missiles that were 24 meters long.
Era imposible ocultar.
It was impossible to hide them.
Y por lo tanto, lo primero que cuando Raúl Castro, que era ministro de las Fuerzas Armadas, el comandante Raúl Castro, que era ministro de las Fuerzas Armadas, fue a la Unión Soviética en mes de julio del 62 para puntualizar el despliegue de esa fuerza, Fidel le planteó que le hiciera a Khrushchev una sola pregunta: ¿qué pasaría si eran descubiertos los cohetes antes que terminara la operación, antes que se completara la operación?
So when Raúl Castro, the commander of the armed forces, went to the Soviet Union in July of that year, to finalize the plan, he asked one question: what is going to happen if the Americans discover the plan before the missiles are operational, before the project is finished?
Nikita Khrushchev no estuvo de acuerdo. Khrushchev planteó que si eran descubiertos, ellos enviarían a Cuba la flota del Báltico.
And Khrushchev said that if they were discovered, the Soviet Union would dispatch to the Caribbean the Baltic fleet of the Soviet Union.
Como es lógico, la dirección cubana no fue tan ingenua de creer que la flota del Báltico iba a resolver ese problema en una área geopolítica de influencia de Estados Unidos.
And of course, the Cubans were left speechless because they couldn't imagine how that would resolve the situation, sending the Baltic fleet to an area so geostrategically sensitive to the United States as the Caribbean.
Esa respuesta, lo que vimos, esa respuesta es la disposición de el gobierno de la Unión Soviética de llevar a su máxima conclusión la operación que se había propuesto. Pues era la Unión Soviética que conocía realmente cuál era la relación de fuerza entre ellos y Estados Unidos. Conocía la situación internacional, tenía más experiencia de Cuba en estos problemas internacionales. Por lo tanto, en esa disposición, de este punto de vista, entendimos la respuesta de Khrushchev.
No entendí bien qué has dicho ahora mismo.
Mira, a partir de la experiencia que considerábamos los cubanos que tenía la Unión Soviética, un país que combatió en las dos primeras guerras mundiales del siglo XX, la Primera y Segunda Guerra Mundial, que fue la potencia victoriosa contra el fascismo en el año 45, que tenían un conocimiento exacto de la relación de fuerza entre ellos y los Estados Unidos. Es decir, a partir de todos esos elementos, pensamos que era una decisión que ellos tomaban que se basaba en estos aspectos esenciales para llevar a cabo una operación de este tipo como la que ellos se habían planificado.
So we form the opinion that the Soviet Union, having been the power that defeated fascism and had the experience of the Second World War, was fully in charge of understanding the nature of what it was about to do in terms of supporting Cuba in this way.
Como esta es una operación que era difícil ocultar, cuando comenzaron a llegar estos armamentos a Cuba, no los cohetes, sino las otras armamentos que venían como apoyo a esos cohetes, es decir, las tropas convencionales, unidades de infantería motomecanizado, las unidades de defensa antiaérea, coheteriles de defensa antiaérea, las unidades blindadas, las unidades de la Marina, etcétera, etcétera, la aviación, primero fueron las que llegaron a Cuba. Este reforzamiento militar que obligó a la Unión Soviética a aumentar el tránsito naval desde la Unión Soviética a Cuba, hizo que se comenzara a descubrir que estaba pasando algo, que había un reforzamiento militar de Cuba para la inteligencia. Tenían que pasar por una región que era vigilada por la OTAN, es decir, por los aliados norteamericanos. Venían esos barcos. La cantidad de barcos que llegaron aquí no era una cosa usual.
So, what happened? Well, of course, when all of the material and personnel that was necessary for the construction of these missile sites started to arrive in Cuba, of course, it increased the amount of shipping and transport that was going into Cuba from the Soviet Union. So it became apparent that something was going on. And of course, these ships were monitored by NATO and the allies of the United States. And so it became apparent that there was something, a reinforcement, at least militarily, of Cuba by the Soviet Union happening.
Esta información pasó a los medios de prensa norteamericanos en
And
medio de unas elecciones de segundo término que iba a tener lugar en noviembre. Es decir, políticamente comenzó un gran escándalo en Estados Unidos.
so, of course, what happened was this knowledge became published in the American newspapers. And, of course, it provoked a huge scandal in the United States.
En esas condiciones, la dirección política de Cuba decidió que era necesario firmar un acuerdo militar, hacerlo público para hacer eso. Y se envió una delegación nuevamente a la Unión Soviética, presidida por dos miembros de la dirección nacional del partido de la revolución. Estaba encabezada por el comandante Ernesto Che Guevara y el capitán Emilio Aragonés.
So what Cuba decided in this situation was to send another delegation to Moscow, led by two of the top leaders, including Che Guevara. Sigue.
¿Cuál fue la respuesta? Sí, la idea era firmar el acuerdo, hacerlo público.
So the delegation was to ask for a formal agreement to be declared of mutual defense between the Soviet Union and Cuba. What was the answer? Sigue.
Ajá. ¿Cuál fue la respuesta de Khrushchev? La misma que le dieron a Raúl Castro. Te enviamos la flota del Báltico.
And what was the answer from Khrushchev? Well, the same thing. We'll send the Baltic Fleet.
Y bien. Pero no solamente ese problema, es decir, ya son dos alertas políticas que envía la dirección cubana a la dirección soviética, que no la tienen en cuenta. Pero por otro lado,
there were two things there that the Cuban leadership had alerted to the Soviet leadership, and they were not taken seriously.
Por parte, comienza toda una política de ocultamiento. Cada vez que le preguntaban los americanos, los estadounidenses le preguntaban a los soviéticos, ¿qué ustedes están enviando a Cuba? ¿Armas ofensivas o armas defensivas? ¿Qué están enviando? ¿Armas ofensivas? Y le decían ellos, no, nosotros estamos enviando armas defensivas. Y entraron en el juego de las armas ofensivas o defensivas. Las armas pueden ser de esos dos bandos. Cuando se utiliza para la defensa, son defensivas. Cuando se utiliza para atacar, son ofensivas. Y entraron en ese juego muy peligroso con los Estados Unidos. Y junto a esto hicieron declaraciones públicas los soviéticos. Como hay un comunicado del 11 de septiembre de 1962 de la agencia TASS a nombre del gobierno soviético, donde entre otras cosas decía que la Unión Soviética no necesitaba desplazar de su territorio armas nucleares porque tenía las suficientes para enfrentar a los Estados Unidos. Por lo tanto, ¿qué ocurría ahí? Había otro elemento que era la mentira.
Okay, so what happened? Well, the Soviet Union then started to deny and cover up what was really happening. And they were asked repeatedly by the Americans, what's going on? Are you putting offensive weapons in Cuba? And they kept saying that what they were doing was purely defensive, and that they didn't need to put any serious weaponry on the island because they had sufficient means to defend themselves from their own territory. So that added another element to what was happening, which was basically lying.
¿Cuál fue la posición de Cuba? Contraria a ese juego. nos opusimos a ese juego que estaban los soviéticos con los americanos. ¿Cuál fue la posición de Cuba? No negamos nada. Cuando nos preguntaban y expresamos que Cuba tenía el derecho de tener las armas que estimara conveniente para su defensa. Es decir, nuestra posición es la defensa del principio soberano de la defensa que está reconocido en el artículo 51 de la Carta de Naciones Unidas. Como país agredido, tener las armas que estimara conveniente para defenderse. Esa fue la posición política cubana.
So what was Cuba's response to this game playing? Well, it was to say that the opposite of what the Soviet Union was saying, that we should be open and declare that we had the authority and right, as enshrined in the UN Charter, to acquire whatever weapons we deem necessary and convenient for our own defense. And that we should be open about what we were doing.
Junto a esto, también los soviéticos incurrieron en errores militares. Desplegaron en Cuba 2 divisiones de coheteril antiaérea, SAM, con 144 posiciones de lanzamiento coheteril. Con esos cohetes que no pusieron en operativo, no impidieron que los U-2 volaran y hicieran su trabajo de exploración aérea y esas bases de cohetes que querían ocultar no la defendieron. Todavía nos preguntamos por qué los soviéticos, que querían mantener el secreto a todas luces, no pusieron esas bases, encendieron los radares para disuadir a los U-2 que inspeccionaran esa cuestión. Porque si se tumbaba un U-2 y caía en territorio cubano, no pasaba nada. Por esos días se tumbó un U-2 en China. En mayo del 60 se tumbó un U-2 en el territorio de la Unión Soviética y no pasó nada. Era un derecho porque los U-2 estaban violando el espacio aéreo cubano en vuelos espías.
And so another error that the Soviets made was that they'd installed these anti-aircraft missiles, SAM missiles, surface-to-air missiles, which could shoot down the spy planes that were flying over Cuba, but they didn't do it. And this was at a time when they had already shot down spy planes over their own territory and nothing had happened. So if they'd have shot down the planes flying over Cuba, nothing would have happened either, but they didn't do it. So they allowed the spy planes to fly over Cuba, and the consequences, of course, are obvious.
La situación climatológica que había en esos meses de septiembre y principios de octubre no les facilitaron que las fotografías que tomaban los U-2 captaran las bases de los cohetes, estos que hablábamos, los R-12, que ya comenzaron a instalar a Cuba desde mediados de septiembre.
So they started to install the missiles from the middle of September, but the weather was not conducive to allowing the U-2 spy planes to photograph the bases. So climatologically, for most of September and early October, there was no possibility of photographing the arrival and installation of the rockets.
Pero además, el día 14 de octubre amanece un día despejado, no hay nubes, y se planifica un vuelo de un U-2 por la región occidental del país, cerca de donde ellos habían detectado una base de coheteril antiaéreo. Y el avión se desvía 1000 metros y vuela por encima de un grupo coheteril R-12 en San Cristóbal.
So what happened? Well, on the 14th of October, the dawn came with a clear day, and they just happened to send a spy plane over the western part of Cuba, over San Cristobal, where there was an installation of the missiles.
El 15, bueno, el desarrollo tecnológico no es el actual. En 15 esas fotografías se revelan, el 16 se conoce y ese día 16 se le informa a Kennedy de esa situación y comienzan los famosos 13 días de la crisis para los norteamericanos.
So it took a day in those days to develop the photographs. So the 15th, and then on the morning of the 16th, it became apparent that there were missile bases in Cuba, and Kennedy was informed straight away on the 16th of October, and then commenced the famous 13 days of the missile crisis.
La primera semana de esa crisis, que va del 16 al día 22, fue un momento muy peligroso para Cuba y para el mundo, porque los americanos sabían en secreto y te podían dar el lujo, con el tiempo que quisieran, de decidir qué opción emplear.
So these days, first week of this crisis, from the 16th to the 22nd of October, were very, very dangerous days for Cuba because they had the information in secret and were making up their minds what to do.
Y deciden, aunque la primera opción que ellos apoyaban era un ataque aéreo quirúrgico, pero no lo aprueban, no se aprueba, y deciden emplear el bloqueo aeronaval contra Cuba para impedir la entrada de los cohetes y impedir sobre todo la entrada de las ojivas nucleares, que no lograron impedir. Y decidieron por el bloqueo aeronaval, que llamaron llamaron, se me olvidó el nombre ahora.
Quarantine.
Sí, la cuarentena.
Cuarentena.
La cuarentena. Le pusieron el nombre de cuarentena. Es decir, ellos siempre enmascaran todas las medidas agresivas.
So they decided in the end, having discounted the idea of attacking Cuba or invading Cuba, on a blockade to prevent the arrival of armaments into Cuba. They didn't call it a blockade because that would be an act of war. They decided to call it a quarantine to avoid using a terminology that would imply an act of aggression.
Cuba no fue sorprendida. No fue sorprendida el día 22 de octubre. No fue sorprendida. Ya, antes de que hablara Kennedy a las 7 de la noche, ya Fidel había puesto al país en pie de guerra. Se dio la alarma de combate.
So Cuba was not surprised on the 22nd of October when Kennedy made his announcement. It wasn't surprised at all because they were expecting it from all that I've said before. And Fidel immediately put Cuba on a war footing.
Mientras que hablaba Kennedy, nosotros estábamos movilizando a todo el país.
While Kennedy was actually speaking, the whole country was being mobilized.
En menos de 12 horas movilizamos a 290,000 efectivos, tanto permanentes como de reserva.
So within 12 hours, we had mobilized 290,000 men, reservists as well as standing troops.
En el curso de la crisis, creamos otras unidades militares que armamos. Es decir, sintetizando esta idea, armamos para la crisis de octubre a 400,000 hombres con armas en la mano para defender a Cuba.
In the course of the crisis, we also mobilized more, so that at one point we had 400,000 persons with arms ready to defend Cuba.
Más se crearon cientos, miles de brigadas especiales como fueron brigadas sanitarias, brigadas ingenieras, brigadas contra incendios, que también tenían un papel en la defensa del país.
And as well as this, we mobilized hundreds of brigades for civil defense, medical services, fire brigades, and so forth, in order to assist in the defense of the country.
Pero además de eso, cuando estalló la crisis, el 22 de octubre, ya en Cuba había 41.900 efectivos soviéticos.
¿Cuántos?
41.900 soviéticos en Cuba, de todas las armas.
So there were 49,000 troops from the Soviet Union as well in Cuba at that time.
Para ese momento, los servicios de inteligencia de Estados Unidos calculaban que en Cuba había alrededor de 18.000 a 22.000 soviéticos, y es el doble.
The Americans thought there were only around 20,000 Soviet troops. There were more than double that number, in actual fact.
Tampoco habían detectaron los puestos, pero no detectaron las armas nucleares, es decir, las ojivas nucleares, ni cuando llegaron esas ojivas nucleares. Y además tampoco detectaron que habían también ojivas nucleares de carácter táctico para otro tipo de armas.
And they didn't know either that there were the number of nuclear warheads that we had, or the fact that we had tactical nuclear weapons as well.
Estos elementos hacen que la crisis sea aún más peligrosa de lo que los propios norteamericanos creían.
And this meant that the crisis was actually more serious than the Americans themselves thought at the time.
Cuando se dieron las conferencias, estas tripartitas del año 1992 y el 2002 en La Habana, que participó el que fue secretario de Defensa de Estados Unidos, Robert McNamara, al conocer todos estos elementos, él mismo se sorprendió y dice, la crisis fue mucho más peligrosa de lo que habíamos imaginado en aquel momento, lo cual podría haber llevado a errores y hubiera estallado una guerra nuclear. Ahora bien, ¿sí?
So when we had the tripartite conferences in Havana in 92 and 2002, and in which the Secretary of Defense at the time, Robert McNamara, actually participated, and he found out the details that of the weapons that we had, he was surprised and shocked and said that he had no idea at the time, and that the crisis was much worse, could have been much worse than they had thought at the time.
Es decir, esa era la situación. Para Cuba, el pueblo estaba decidido a defender, el pueblo cubano a defender la revolución en todo momento. En ese curso de esa semana, la única noticia que habíamos tenido de la Unión Soviética había sido el 22 y el 23 de octubre, donde en declaraciones de Khrushchev, que parecía que iban a resistir, que iban a no dejar al imperialismo hacer nada. Eran las declaraciones que lo catalogaban de pirata, etcétera. Esas eran las voces de Khrushchev. No tuvimos más elementos. En Cuba mantuvimos una gran moral, había una gran moral en el pueblo de Cuba, había una gran disposición para la defensa del país. Esa era la situación. Y nos preparamos para resistir cualquier tipo de ataque.
So we had no other knowledge of what the Soviets' response was other than the declarations of Khrushchev on the 23rd, which was in defiance of the United States. And the morale of the Cuban people was extremely high. We were very well disposed to doing what was necessary to defend our country.
En esos días se incrementaron los vuelos de espías rasantes, es decir, a baja altura.
And during these days, they increased the frequency of the spy plane flights and reduced the altitude of the planes flying over.
De Estados Unidos.
From the United States.
Lo que provocó que el día 26 de octubre, Fidel, en carta al secretario general de Naciones Unidas, planteó que a partir del 27, todo avión que volara a baja altura, las armas antiaéreas cubanas, las armas antiaéreas, la artillería antiaérea le dispararía a esos aviones.
So this resulted in Fidel Castro declaring on the 26th of October that from the day after the 27th, that any flights would be shot down.
Precisamente cuando amaneció el 27, se amaneció combatiendo con los aviones. Los aviones que volaban a baja altura enseguida cogieron, se elevaron para defenderse del tiro de la artillería antiaérea cubana.
So,
fue el día.
So on the 27th, the plane started to fly higher because the Cubans started to fire at them.
Por los partes sabemos que algunos de esos aviones fueron alcanzados por la artillería cubana, pero no derribados. Pero el día 27, a las 10:30, alrededor de las 10:30 de la mañana, volaba 1-2 por la región oriental. Cuando pasó por Bane, un cohete antiaéreo soviético le disparó y derribó a 1-2.
But on the 27th at about 2:30 in the morning, a U-2 plane flying over Cuba was shot down by a Soviet surface-to-air missile.
Es decir, que se agravó considerablemente la crisis. Pero los cubanos no mantuvimos nuestro honor y apoyamos esa decisión. Es decir, los soviéticos, los antiaéreos, coheteriles antiaéreos orientales allá en Bayamo, se solidarizaron con la decisión cubana de disparar los aviones. A nosotros no nos interesaba derribar a los judíos, sino para nosotros era un peligro los vuelos de baja altura, porque eran vuelos de exploración, pero si venían eran los mismos aviones que se utilizarían para el ataque. Sabemos ahora que ellos ya tenían planificado para el día 28 o 29 de octubre un ataque aéreo contra Cuba.
So what we weren't concerned about the U-2 planes. The Soviets shot it down in solidarity with us, but we weren't bothered too much about the U-2 planes. We were concerned about the low altitude planes because what they were doing was carrying out reconnaissance in order to check out our positions, because they were planning a bombardment of Cuba and they were checking out our own air defense positions so that they could knock out our air defenses. So we were concerned about the low-flying flights, not the high-altitude ones, which was the U-2 planes.
En esa coyuntura, conocimos los cubanos que ya venían negociando de manera secreta Kennedy y Khrushchev. Nos enteramos por cartas públicas que hicieron los soviéticos de esas negociaciones.
So that's when we began to realize then that there was some diplomatic solutions being worked out in letters between the Soviet Union and the United States, because some messages were made public.
Una carta pública fue la del 27 de octubre, entre las cosas que venía en la carta, se hablaba del cambio de los cohetes de Turquía por los cohetes en Cuba.
So one letter that was made public was this exchange idea of missiles in Cuba for missiles in Turkey.
Esa noticia a Cuba, a los cubanos, no nos agradó. No fue del agrado de Cuba, porque nos sentíamos convertidos en una moneda de cambio.
This didn't sit well with us because it meant that we were like some kind of pawn of exchange between the two of them. We weren't appreciative of this idea at all.
Más aún nos disgustó la carta del 28.
And we were even more disgusted by the letter of the 28th.
Donde se llegaba a un acuerdo, un arreglo entre Kennedy y Khrushchev para la retirada de los cohetes de Cuba sin haber consultado con Cuba y sin posibilitar la participación cubana en las negociaciones.
So this was where there was an agreement between Kennedy and Khrushchev without the participation of Cuba and without the possibility of Cuba having been party to any of the negotiations.
Es decir, pero más aún en la carta del 28 se le daba la posibilidad de comprobar el desmantelamiento de los cohetes in situ, violando un aspecto de la soberanía de Cuba. Por lo tanto, no fue aceptado por la dirección cubana.
And of course, also in this agreement, it included the inspection of the missile sites, which would have been a breach of Cuban sovereignty and was therefore not acceptable to the Cuban leadership.
Ese mismo día, horas de la tarde, Fidel plantó el programa de 5 puntos para resolver el problema. ¿Cuáles eran los 5 puntos? Muy
so
sencillo.
at this point, Fidel Castro tabled the 5 points to resolve the situation. What were these 5 points?
Es decir, ¿cuáles eran esos puntos? Uno, el cese del bloqueo económico. Resumido.
These were 5 points of Cuban demands. The first one was the cessation completely of the economic blockade of Cuba.
Segundo,
Second,
el cese de la política subversiva, es decir, de las acciones subversivas contra Cuba, es decir, organización de invasiones, ataques a las costas cubanas, etc. Es decir, de toda esa política subversiva contra el país.
The second one was cessation of all the subversive activities against Cuba, including sabotage, invasions, etc.
El tercero, el cese de los ataques piratas, tanto por aire como por mar a Cuba y a las embarcaciones cubanas en el mar.
And the second one was the pirate attacks from outside against Cuba from external sources, against the coast and so forth.
El cuarto, el cese de las violaciones aéreas a Cuba, es decir, el espacio aéreo por la aviación.
And the fourth one was the ceasing of overflights by spy planes.
Y el quinto y el último era la devolución de los territorios ocupados por la base naval en Guantánamo. Y la devolución de eso.
And the fifth one was ending the naval occupation of Guantanamo Bay.
Eran medidas, eran puntos realmente que se podían lograr. Pero como no nos dieron participación los soviéticos, no pudimos negociar. Y sobre todo nos opusimos a la verificación en sitio de la salida. Estábamos defendiendo los principios de soberanía y autodeterminación en contra de una política de presiones, una política de fuerza contra Cuba. Es decir, la defensa de esos principios fueron básicos para el país.
Okay, so the point was that these 5 points could have been tabled in the negotiations and could have been achieved, but they were never given the opportunity to do so because the Soviets made the deal themselves without the inclusion of the Cuban leadership in the negotiations. And what the Cubans were very much mindful of was the infringement of sovereignty that this implied. And in particular, they were very aggrieved and opposed to the idea of allowing for inspections of the sites by American or even UN observers. And that was because they were defending the principle of sovereignty throughout.
Y los acuerdos entre Khrushchev y Kennedy del día 28 lograron alejar una guerra nuclear y que la humanidad pudiera respirar en paz.
So the agreements between Kennedy and Khrushchev did avoid a nuclear war and allowed humanity to breathe in peace.
Ese momento para Cuba fue más peligroso.
But this moment for Cuba was even more dangerous.
Y la crisis se extendió hasta el 20 de noviembre, cuando se decidió desmantelar el bloqueo aeronaval. Es decir, para Cuba no finalizó el 28 de octubre, sino se extendió hasta noviembre, el 20 de noviembre, que el bloqueo aeronaval a Cuba se fue
because
desmantelado.
The crisis didn't end on the 28th of October for Cuba. The crisis didn't end until the 20th of November, because it was until then that the Americans maintained their air and naval blockade of the island. It wasn't lifted until the 20th of November.
No estuvimos de acuerdo de una inspección de una inspección al país.
We were not willing to accept an inspection of the country.
Por lo tanto, nos mantuvimos defendiendo nuestros principios, discutiendo con la Unión Soviética, primero con UTAN, que vino a Cuba el día 30, tuvo el día 30 y 31 de octubre en el país, y más tarde, cuando vino el día 4 de noviembre, que llevó Mikoyan para discutir con Cuba, es decir, y defendimos nuestros principios. Y con esto creo que ya he hablado bastante y espero la pregunta de ustedes.
Thank you. So we defended our principles against Khrushchev, who and Uthant from the United Nations, who came to the country to ask us to allow for the inspections, but we refused to accept them because we were defending the principles of sovereignty and national self-determination upon which we based our revolution from the start. I think I've said enough. I've spoken plenty, and I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Muchas gracias, Tomás. Fue excelente. Gracias. Okay. So now it's time for Håken Karlsson from the University of Gothenburg, who will talk to us about the research that he has been doing now for quite some years in Cuba on the missile sites themselves. And I think Håkan is going to speak in English.
Yeah, that's right. I will do it in English. No, you don't need a break or something in 5 minutes, or I will do it quite quickly. So
okay,
and
no,
we will,
let's carry on.
No, it's better to use the opportunity when there is a connection functioning. No, as Tomás has presented, he has showed also that the crisis has been profoundly investigated by a number of people, not at least Tomás, that has done a great work, because he has described the crisis from a Cuban point of view. Very much of the work done by historians are based in the US and other parts of the world, and yeah, he has complemented our knowledge about the crisis in certain ways. But the thing is, from my point of view as archaeologist, the crisis has been investigated profoundly, mostly by historians, but the whole time these investigations are moving on the meta level, you can say, and it's a connection of the crisis toward politics during the Cold War, and often the starting point is military strategic reasonings and approaches close to that. Of course, that research has learned us a lot, and it has enriched our knowledge about the crisis in different ways. But from my point of view as archaeologist, there is a constant repetition of the, what you can call the dominant narrative of the crisis, in the way that Tomás has done here today. Also, it's it's this story, and the crisis is in that kind of way investigated. Every second of the crisis is more or less well documented. But there are other kind of sources that has been, you can say, repressed, neglected. For example, and it is at that point that I'm entering as archaeologist. There is for instance, the material remains of these sites. The 9 sites here in Cuba where the Soviet Union placed their nuclear rockets. That's one thing that hasn't been researched. The other thing is, what kind of memories have people that are living on the Cuban countryside in small villages close to those sites. As the thing is today, the material remains of these missile installations can still be found at all those places. And there are also numerous memories and narrations that people in the countryside hold concerning those sites, and that has been a sort of a starting point for me and for our project, to look at how this global crisis was perceived by people that suddenly found themselves in the epicenter of a global crisis. With that in mind, we started this project. I was never to say in the Stone Age. It was 2005, and our possibility to start the project. It was Tomás that was responsible for that also, because he was the person that invited us, that arranged all the paperwork for investigate those sites. We named the project World Crisis from Below, and that project is still going on as a cooperation between Swedish archaeologists and Cuban archaeologists, historians, and anthropologists. And the project has been focused precisely on these dimensions of the crisis: the material remains of the former Soviet nuclear missile sites, and the memories and narration held by people in the countryside and in the local communities surrounding these sites. the idea with that is to complement the dominant narration of the crisis with you can say with sources from below and reaching a new kind of knowledge that has also in some kind of way you can say more human dimension of the crisis. And the questions that we have approached has been quite simple. Is it possible to complement the dominant narrative of the Octubre crisis and reach new forms of knowledge about this historical event through studies of its material and immaterial remains in Cuba? And question those two, if that's the case, in what kind of way can this new knowledge complement and also perhaps challenge the dominant narration? And of course, these overall questions are divided in a number of more specific questions. What material remains are still existing at the former nuclear missile sites? In what way have people reused the material remains of these old bases? And what memories and narratives do people have of the crisis and of the missile sites? And also, during the last year, we have been looking at how the regional museums want to use the sites, or the plans for using them for tourism, for education, and other things. Perhaps it's a bit odd to work as archaeologist with remains that are quite recent, but the thing is that at the theoretical and methodological level, this project is anchored in a general development of an archaeological interest in contemporary remains. You can call it an archaeology of the contemporary past. And an archaeological approach that looks like that, it is of course multidisciplinary because it combines theories and methods from disciplines such as archaeology, history, and anthropology. And the information from physical material remains, oral and written sources are used and permitted to interact for reaching new forms of knowledge. At the same time, at the methodological level, this approach implies, for example, working with archival studies, archaeological surveys and excavations, and with interviews, questionnaires, and photographic documentation. And when archaeological excavations are carried out, we have done it during these 15 years at 2 or 3 occasions, archaeological excavations at these sites. We're trying to work also together with people living close to the sites because it's in the Cuban situation. I think that's important that people can feel that they are a part of creating their own history. Because when we started with this, the peasants didn't understand because Fidel knew everything about this. The people higher up know everything. No, but that's not the thing that are interesting us. We're interested in your point of view. Did you meet the Russian soldiers? What did happen then? And when people realize that there is a lot of histories coming to the fore. And the results, if I shall just briefly speaking about the results, this project has carried out studies at the 6 sites that were used to locate the R-12 rockets in October 1962. And the sites are El Cacho, El Pitirre, Santa Cruz Los Pinos, La Rosa, Citecito, and El Purio. And 4 of them are located in Western Cuba and two in the middle. We have used for collecting memories. We have used anthropological methods such as interviews, concerning the archaeological part, we have, and as I mentioned, at some occasions we have done traditional archaeological excavations at structures at those sites, but mostly it has been work of documenting and create maps and things about the structures on those sites. But because the thing is that those sites don't have any kind of antiquarian protection here in Cuba, and people are using things the whole time from reusing things. That's interesting in itself, but it means that the sites are distracted in some kind of way. At the same time, the people that have direct memories for themselves of these happenings 60 years ago, they are growing old and they are disappearing. We worked in 15 years, and there is a lot of interviews collected that presented by people that are now dead, and therefore it's urgent in some kind of way to collect those memories also. And from my point of view, the project has been and still is fruitful, and it has succeeded in creating new knowledge about the precise location of the various structures of the old rocket sites. And also concerning the reuse, for instance, of the material remains by local societies. And there are a lot of interesting material histories involved here. For instance, material from the Second World War produced in the United States that was presented to the Soviet Union during the Second World War, and that were used at those sites in 1962, and now the material is used on the countryside in a number of ways. We have been doing that also, kind of documenting the life histories of different kinds of material. And you can say that in some kind of way we have succeeded to lift memories from below, held by people at the countryside and in local communities. And we have started discussions, or have had discussion during years now, with two local museums in Western Cuba, located quite close to the four sites in the western area of the Iceland. And in how are they thinking about this cultural heritage that they have, that they are responsible for, and that are just existing here in Cuba. It's unique. The material is unique in that kind of way that the epicenter of the crisis was located in Cuba and exactly at those sites. And there are plans. But as usual, no money for realize museum exhibitions, open air museums, using it for tourism, using it for education. But as the situation is now, that there is a lack of money here in Cuba for realize that kind of things. We can say that the material and immaterial remains of the crisis, the material culture, objects, and their reuse, together with the presented memories and the narratives of the people who experienced the crisis directly at the Cuban countryside, as well as the efforts of local museums with this cultural heritage, have in some kind of way complemented and enriched the dominant narrative of the crisis in various ways, especially since these sources present completely different material and small-scale histories and narratives of the crisis compared to the general or overall narrative. These stories, they are not narrated from a general perspective on the crisis, its development, its internal dynamic, and a military strategy during the Cold War, but rather the opposite, from a point of view from below. And in this kind of way, neglected dimensions of the crisis have been revealed and highlighted. And the new form of knowledge about the crisis that the project has reached is that it has allowed for these expressions from below to come forth, and it contributes to other dimensions of the crisis. And as archaeologists, the material remains are of course very interesting, but for me, the most interesting examples of the human dimensions of the crisis can be found in the memories and narration held by people, because there existed friendly and intense contacts between the Cuban people in the countryside and in local communities and the Soviet soldiers, and in some cases also after the crisis in the form of letters and so on, and interchange, and it's interesting contexts where people from completely different parts of the world exchanged their fear, hopes, and dreams of their lives and concerning the future. And of course, that's a part of this crisis also, because it's people interacting the whole time. Yes, we have complemented the overall narrative, but the question is if these kind of sources, these kind of a contemporary archaeological project can challenge the overall story. I don't think so, but the thing that we have shown that I think is important is that the historical events that they are never so simple as we sometimes believe, because there are people involved. There are people involved on different level, not just the highest level where the decision about the crisis, the negotiations concern the crisis, the solution. Of course, people are acting there also, but the thing that we have revealed is ordinary people's ideas, their experiences of the crisis. And as just briefly I've mentioned, there are material stories existing in the material that we have studied that are presenting a completely different view. For example, this intermix of material produced in the Soviet Union, but also in the United States, that was also part of the material machinery, or what you can call during October 1962. Ordinary people behind, directly involved in historical events. There are always more complex dimensions, you can say, to be found beyond every big history of an event, because people are moving in the under vegetation in different manners, and I think that those personally, I hope that this country can use this material remain in different ways, because for instance, you can talk about the tourism, but for me personally, I think that those sites, especially in these days that we're living, they can be used for showing in the form of exhibitions or open air exhibitions also, that a kind of reflection about what could have gone very wrong. This time it wasn't like that, but and of course during these years there have been proposals of making those sites or some of those sites to World Heritage. But I don't know if that's the way to go, but the idea, of course, is interesting because in UNESCO's World Heritage List, there is a lot of examples that are showing the progress of humans, but there are few cases that are showing when the world was going in a wrong direction. This is one example that could add something, because as Tomás said when he started his presentation, was that this crisis did affect the whole world in one way or another. But we will see what will happen. But for me personally, I think that they should use it for some kind of tourism, education, with the theme of peace, for instance. Because the country need resources, the country need money, and they have a material that is totally unique. But we will see what will happen with that. And thank you very much for your attention. It was brief, but hopefully I have presented another, what should I say, another angle of the crisis.
Yes. What's interesting to me is the thought that this event, which really brought the end of the world, has got this physical remains. Obviously, the Soviets built installations of concrete and so forth. And I guess they're in, like you say, a state of almost complete destruction now. And so the actual kind of physical memory is in danger of being completely lost. I mean, is there anywhere that is actually kind of intact, that is still in a shape or a form that resembled what it was when it was built in 1962?
Yeah, there exist those sites because the structure of those sites they were mirrors of each other, because the regiments were taken from Soviet Union, from Ukraine, and they were transporting it and rebuilding it as a kind of kit for. There was the same distance to the ramps, the same distance to it. It was a plan. And of those 6 sites, still the center of that kind of base was the hangar, where the intention was to mount the nuclear warhead with a rocket body. There are still three hangars standing on 3 different sites. And yes, and that's interesting, but because the accordance between the Soviet Union and the US was so rapid that they did not have the time to dismantle it and transport it back to the Soviet Union. So they are still standing there in the middle of anything, you can say, in 2 of the cases. In the 3rd case, it's well integrated in a place that was the former training ground for the Cuban special troops. And there is perfect infrastructure for going and see that kind of hangar. The other 2 are in the middle of the jungle, you can say.
And so they're just standing there empty in the middle of the jungle with plants growing around them and stuff. Yeah. Interesting. Really interesting.
Yeah, no, the kind of ruin romanticism is when we visit those places, but because they were the center of the world 60 years ago. Now they are, and they were also part of military technique that was high tech 60 years ago. Now they are abandoned and forgotten.
Yeah, yeah, interesting. And you said that there was some stuff that they used that was actually brought to the Soviet Union during the Second World War. What was that?
That was the things that they invented in the US, mainly in the war in the Pacific. They needed what you say. They needed to quote in English. I don't for the airplanes. You had to construct runways for
Runways.
yeah, and they invented in the US in 1941 concrete steel mats that you could connect to each other in a way where you could create a landing area for airplanes very quickly. That kind of material was given to the Soviet Union during the Second World War.
Right.
For using and the Soviets used it in the Soviet Union and also here in Cuba for stabilizing the ground, for instance, and they were using it for constructing shelters and so on. And there were a lot of that material transported here, and that stuff was left here also. And in Western Cuba and close to the sites, they have been reused in every possible way. As walls in barns and as everything. They are everywhere. as the peasant here call them Russian carpets.
Russian carpets. Right. Fantastic.
Yeah, it's interesting, and that kind of material life story of that material is super interesting in some kind of way, because that material are telling other story, telling the story about the time when the Soviet Union and the US worked together for other purpose, and that's also a kind of story that creates friction in the world we have lived after the Second World War. It's interesting.
It's ironic and transcendent of the actual moment, isn't it? It kind of connects the two in a different way. Interesting. Exactly. Really interesting. Well, it's been a remarkably successful event, in actual fact. I have to report that very few people attended, but that doesn't matter because we now have a recording of this, and it will be available for posterity on YouTube. So, tengo que agradecerles por el evento. Ha sido muy exitoso, en mi opinión. He dicho que no hay mucha gente que ha compartido con nosotros esta tarde, pero eso no importa porque está grabado y voy a poner la grabación en YouTube. Y para eso será posible alcanzarlo para siempre, mientras que existe el World Wide Web.
Yeah, that's nice.
Okay. So I'm going to say thanks again and bid you farewell from a very cold UK. You're very fortunate in Cuba to have 27 degrees. You're getting applause from one of our audience already, so that's good news. And so thanks once again to Håkan Karlsson and Tomás Diez Acosta. And thanks to those of you who took the time to join us tonight. And
thanks to you also for organizing it. and that it was possible to realize it.
It was fantastic. We're going to have to do it again and more often. Yeah. I can't believe how well the connection with Cuba has been today. It's just been fantastic.
Today it has been fantastic.
Good night.
Yeah. Espero que esto te haya hecho pasar mucho trabajo traduciendo.
No, no hay de qué. Estaba un poco nervioso en principio porque no pensaba que sería posible, pero estaba bien, creo. Estaba muy bien. Ciao.
Thanks, and we keep in touch.
Yes, absolutely. Let's stay in touch. Good night, everybody. Good night.
Good night.